Something else that I'd love to touch on is, and I think one of the forgotten aspects of climate change is in regards to food scarcity and food production. Would you be so kind as to outline some of the implications that sit with those?
Yes. So we can expect a lot of changes in our agricultural systems and also in our food supply systems over time. Now, what's very interesting is that the agricultural system is also responsible for a lot of emissions, depending on how you do agriculture. But at the same time, it's also most vulnerable to the potential changes coming forward. So there's a range of challenges that we will face. So part of them will be, I think the largest concern is water supply and how the change in climate will result in different types of water supply. Generally, and again, this is a very broad generalization, we're going to see much more difficulty accessing irrigation. And that will have a huge impact on where we have agriculture today. But we'll also see things like different types of pests, different types of diseases that affect plants coming and affect the environment, spreading through Australia as the climate changes. We're already seeing the start of that. CSIRO does an incredible amount of work on that and trying to understand what that will mean. We will also see impacts on supply chains, how people get those foods, who's selling to who, where are we transporting them, how are we getting them to actual markets. All of those things are vulnerable to climate changes going forward and will put a lot of shocks and pressures on those sectors. But at the same time, there's a lot of opportunities in terms of thinking about what is the technology we're deploying in the agricultural space. Can we do things better? Can we think about different varieties of plants and different seeds? There's a lot of agri-technology going into that. Also thinking about irrigation systems and how we protect ourselves against those. So I think the agricultural sector and our food systems is going to face a lot of challenges and undergo a lot of change as we adapt to climate.
Once again, the takeaway for advisors, perhaps, I know traditionally when forecasting expenses and costs associated with retirees potentially maintaining lifestyles, usually they'll plug in, inflation, the typical inflation number of 3%. But from what I've read, the expectation around food pricing could be a lot more than just typical inflation rates, particularly as we project out another 20 or 30 years. That cost could continually increase.
I think on that point, that's absolutely right. So one of the things when we think about this, when we're looking at an economic angle, is that climate is likely to increase things like inflation shocks. So we've started to see impacts of that. One example is the Panama Canal in the US. That actually massively depends on rainfall because a lot of it is internal lakes in the country. And so as they suffer and they've had lower rainfall, the ability to ship ships through the Panama Canal has been threatened, right? And that gives rise to problems in the supply chain, which drive inflationary costs. Now, one of the things that Australia is actually a net exporter of agricultural produce. So we're kind of insulated from that. But under some of the bigger concerns, we could suddenly switch becoming a net importer of agriculture and food. And that would put a lot of stress on household budgets and potential inflation of food.
And on that topic of stress, potential stresses, problems, I'd like to maybe delve into human health. Clearly, increased temperatures are going to have a profound impact on our health. Some of the other reading and investigation I've done has spoken of more tropical climate conditions, perhaps inducing more pandemic type events. What does your research tell you on the impacts for human health and I guess where that may lead us to?
Yes. So there are a number of impacts that have been identified. And again, this is a widely researched area. Firstly, just the direct impact of higher heat temperatures will lead to more heat waves, which will cause stress and illness across the population. And that is frankly very worrying when we look at those statistics for Australia. But then also the changing climate will lead to different types of pests and diseases, very similar to the agriculture question. Can we see malaria being spread out to larger parts of Australia and other types of those types of diseases? But also, unfortunately, as anyone who lived in Sydney in 2020 will tell you about, is greater bushfires, respiratory illnesses affecting the population more broadly. So there are a lot of areas in which we will face stresses to our health. What makes it kind of worse as well, and you see this in other parts of climate, is that it's not necessarily everyone equally affected. So we will see greater impact on people who are more vulnerable to health issues, like the elderly and the retirees, younger people, but also people who are not necessarily in good health. Pregnant women is another one that even if you're young and healthy and having a baby, pregnant women are very vulnerable to these types of impacts. And so, yes, we will see some quite significant challenges.
How do you think private health insurers will respond to some of those implications?
One of the issues when we're looking through that and working with our private health insurance clients is many of those costs will actually fall on the public health system as opposed to the private health system. So they might fall in terms of GP care, or they might fall in terms of emergency admissions at hospital, which are generally publicly covered. And most of the impacts that would fall onto the private health system would actually also come through stresses on the health system in general, rather than necessarily on the services that are covered by your private health insurance. And ultimately, as we have more illness, health costs go up, and that would result in higher health insurance premiums. But it would also result in, I have to say, higher need for taxes that cover our public system as well over time.
Yeah, it's really interesting. All of these things, when I look at it from a financial planning perspective, what I can see is that the traditional model of perhaps allocating, the 3% inflation rate to expected future costs, we might be looking at having to go well over and above that as a projected rate down the track. If I can stop a moment and perhaps just talk about, from an Australian perspective, not all states and areas and regions will be affected by climate change equally. Are you able to perhaps outline those areas that are more at risk than others and the reasons behind that?
Sure. And absolutely, we expect differential impacts of climate across the country. One of the things we look very closely at is where cyclones happen, where flood happens. This is part of me being an actuary, and where bushfires happen. And I mean, the overall picture is that the further north you are in Australia, the more at risk you are. Those are the parts of the country. Northern Australia is where we get our cyclones, where we get our heat stress in far larger numbers. But that's not to say that, if you're sitting in Tasmania, you'll be fine, because flood risks, for example, will be affected down there in those places. So there's no place that's exempt from this general trend, but we do generally see that northern parts of Australia are more at risk than southern parts. There is also an issue whereby if you're already at risk today, things will get worse. So if you're already in a flood zone, or if you're already close, you already have a bushfire risk on your home or your business, those will significantly increase over time. And in fact, much of what we see right now is that people who are already exposed to these types of issues, they will have it even worse. It won't necessarily spread to more areas. It does in some places. It will spread and have a wider footprint. But most of the impact is if you've already exposed, you will have a far bigger impact over time.
For advisors sitting there, in our audience, many of the questions that they face from their clients, particularly heading into retirement, may be around, a sea change, the client looking to retire up north or downsize their property. Now, obviously, with some of the things that you've just mentioned, that could be particularly dangerous. Is there a way, or is there some information that advisors can call on to help identify some of those risks for clients if they're looking to buy in particular areas or regions from a property perspective?
Unfortunately, I have to say the answer is no. There is no, website that you can go in, put in property, and you'll get all your answers. There are bits and pieces here and there. Different councils will have different information. But in Australia, we're still trying to develop that one overall asset or information portal to help guide consumers, to guide governments, and to guide businesses to understand what this means. It's a work in progress. We need it very quickly, and the government knows that, and there's a lot going on in that space. But right now, I don't think there is something generally that you can get. So in the interim, there's a few things you can do. I mean, I mentioned there, looking at council flood maps and those things, but also a really good indicator is your insurance cost. Take that property, put it in multiple insurance websites and see what it would cost to insure it. I think it's, generally speaking, when people are doing this, it's kind of the bottom of their list. It's the last thing they think about. And what I think the first thing to do is push that up your list. Have a look at that before you make any kind of decision. But yeah, it is a big gap, and it's certainly something that we in Australia need to look at and start to have this. We need, not just for your financial advisors and their customers, but we also need, state governments when they're making planning decisions to be making those in ways that don't put people at risk and don't put property at risk. And that's still a work in progress.